Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on Homefront: The Revolution. This is an open-world first-person shooter by Dam Buster Games and published by Deep Silver, and I'm taking a look at it courtesy of a Steam free weekend here. And after the time I put into it, the only question I have, the only thought that comes to mind with this game is, why does this game exist? The original Homefront was not a good game. In fact, it pretty much sucked. The multiplayer was halfway decent, but the single player was downright terrible, and the game was just overall a mess. And then you get to this one. It's single player and co-op only. Nobody is playing the co-op at all, so I couldn't actually assess that. But when I went over to the single player, I was treated to about 10 minutes of cutscenes, where I couldn't do anything. And then once I was able to do something, it put me through another about 20 to 30 minutes of tutorials. And as I'm doing this video, there's still tutorials going on. It's about an hour and a half, 2 hours in. Granted, they are just of the pop-up message saying, this is how you do this particular thing, and this is what this needs, or this is what your objective is, variety, so they're pretty minimal, but they're still mildly annoying, especially when the game is as frankly simplistic as this thing is. When you get down to it, all this game is just a hopelessly generic open-world action game. What do I mean by that? Well, if you've played just about any open-world action game as of late, then you're going to find that this plays almost exactly the same as those, only it's a first-person shooter, and the only really noteworthy thing about it, in terms of its mechanics, is that you can customize your weapons to some degree. Because other than the hopelessly idiotic weapon customization system, where you can literally just pull the upper receiver off of your M14 and then turn it into a 50 caliber bolt-action rifle with just a quick swap, well, you're left with an open world full of busy work. Do you like capturing strongholds? Well, guess what? That's pretty much all you do in this game. Go from point A to point B, shoot the Norks in the face repeatedly until there's none of them left standing. Occasionally you have to fight an APC or something, in which case it can be taken out by simply shooting the weak spot with your pistol, which is hilarious, I might add, sitting there taking out an APC with a 9mm pistol, which, I might add, is actually more effective than using things like rocket launchers, because that makes sense. But then again, this is a game where you can take the stock of an M14 and turn it into a rocket launcher, so whatever. We're throwing sense out the window, I suppose. Which is all well and good, because once you get past the incredibly repetitive gameplay, which again, just go from point A to point B, blast all the Norks to bits, capture the point, and suddenly you've got a new stronghold for the Resistance, and pretty much that's it, unless you go into a yellow zone, in which case you have to do some rudimentary stealth in order to not be mowed down by lots and lots of dudes who keep respawning. So once you get past all that kind of stuff, well, you end up going into the story territory, which starts off terrible and gets worse the further you get in. Which honestly is not remotely surprising given the fact that the original Homefront had some incredibly bad writing as well. But anyway, you are Brady, a member of the Resistance, and early on in the game you're supposed to meet up with this guy named Walker, who is apparently a legend in the Resistance against the North Koreans, or the Norks as you refer to them, who have somehow managed to become a technological superpower since the 70s, and they are now subjugating the US because that makes sense, apparently. So obviously, you being the red-blooded American that you are, you've got to go in and kick those commie bastards out, right? Well, maybe I would actually give a crap if the writing were actually decent, but it's not. I challenge you to give a crap about any of the characters in this game, to learn their names, to learn why they do what they do, to learn anything beyond, you are American, North Koreans bad, kick them out. That is all the game amounts to when you really get down to it. And the thing is, that could be done well. Red Faction Guerrilla did it really well, actually. The problem is that Homefront: The Revolution is scatterbrained at best, and it reeks of being in development hell. They just threw a bunch of ideas into a blender, and what you end up with is basically just every other generic open-world action game from the past several years, in fact from the past decade or so, just throw into a blender and hit puree without any regard for actually making it work as a coherent whole. Thus you end up with the quick crafting system from more recent games. You get the towers or sorts from the Assassin's Creed series. You get the strongholds from the Far Cry series. You get descent mechanics similar to Red Faction Guerrilla and Just Cause, where when you're in the yellow zones you can complete various actions in order to sow dissent, and eventually they will rise up and throw up the North Koreans out of there, and thus you've now liberated the zone and taken it back for America. And there's weapon customization reminiscent of Crysis, where you can press a button and it brings up the weapon, and you can select, oh, I want to have this sight on it, or I want to have a suppressor, or I want to have a muzzle brake, or I want to have it using this receiver, or whatever. In fact, that last bit is the only unique thing in this entire game. The only unique thing is that you can take your pistol and pull the slide off of it and stick a new attachment on top of it, and suddenly it's a submachine gun. And of course that's just one example, but you get what I mean there. You have a handful of weapons that you can swap out the receivers for, and thus you now have new weapons based on the same exact stuff you've been using. And it's all idiotic, and it's all boring as hell. The few saving graces this game even has are related to visuals, where in particular the environments look really damn good. They have some pretty solid texture quality, the environmental effects are generally pretty well done, and you have some cool lighting effects and such like that. It is of course a CryEngine game, this is kind of to be expected. So they definitely at least did a good job with that, and the sound effects are halfway decent, some of them are better than others, but quite frankly that really doesn't matter. This is a game that came from development hell, and it frankly should have just stayed there. It should never have been released. There is no reason for this game to exist. But you know what? At least it's not something like Ride to Hell Retribution. This game is playable. I will give it that. It's not the worst game I've ever played. It's still a piece of crap, but it's not the worst thing ever like a lot of people were acting like it was. A lot of that came from the fact that the game ran like total garbage when it was released. Now they've patched it up a bit, and it runs generally better than that, but you're still not getting great performance out of it. I mean, on my 970, I got about 40 to 75 FPS most of the time, and it tended to fluctuate somewhere between 50 and 65. So they at the very least sorted that out, but here's the thing. When about the best thing you can say about the game is that it's playable, there's something wrong. And really, that's the biggest problem I have with it. The best elements of the game just bring it up to mediocre territory. And quite frankly, if you're looking for an action game that's centered around rising up against an oppressor, play Red Faction Guerrilla. It has its problems, sure, but that game's a hell of a lot more fun than this. Homefront the Revolution is just insanely boring. And quite frankly, it doesn't even deserve the coverage I'm giving it. Mediocre in all respects, with a soundtrack that is just bland and uninteresting, voice acting that merely works and nothing more, writing that is downright awful, gameplay that is mediocre at its absolute best and mostly pretty crap, but also incredibly derivative, and ultimately, just a game that shouldn't exist. Don't bother with Homefront the Revolution. Play something else. Play Red Faction Guerrilla if you want something like this, but don't even give this one the time of day. Thanks for watching.